Good evening. This is Don Riggs, and I'm your facilitator for this evening's session, Preparing Your Hives for Winter, presented by Matthew Bird. As you can see from here, Matthew is from Harrisville. I believe he belongs to Mountaineer. He did at one point in time. He can maybe do that. He can confirm that. He has been a season inspector. As you can see from here, he's maintained up to 35 hives. Then getting back to sanity, he's going to trim that down to 10. So, and again, as I said, he's one of the seasonal apiary inspectors for this state. So at this point in time, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Matthew, excuse me. And Matthew, go ahead and share your screen and please unmute.
All right, let's see here, Don. I think you can hear me now.
I can hear you for sure, but you need to share your, there you go. We're ready to roll. Okay, you bet.
All right, sounds good. So yeah, as Don was saying, my name is Matthew Bird or Matt. Either one works for me. I have been a beekeeper since I was 16, and I still do belong to Mountaineer Beekeeping Association as well. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit tonight about preparing your hives for winter. I know this is, one of the scary times for not just new beekeepers, but beekeepers in general, as the winter can be very unpredictable here in West Virginia. And of course, we all want our hives to survive the winter so we can maximize whether it's our honey production next year, our queen production, bee production, whatever it is that gets us all interested into beekeeping. So the big question is, what can you do to prepare your hives for winter? Well, the big one is don't panic, because what you've been doing and the decisions that you've made throughout the beekeeping year has helped you already prepare for winter. So you may have already decided on situations like where are your hives located, what genetics of honeybees are you going to use, what direction are your entrances faced, and how much honey or stores did you leave on your hives? But the question still lingers, when do I need to prepare my bees for winter? So when you're preparing your bees for winter, it really occurs all year long. So the things that you do in the beginning of spring are going to contribute to how we manage in the summer, to how we're managing in the fall, and ultimately how we're preparing for winter. I always start my hive preparations and really thinking about my plan for winter after the summer solstice. And things really ramp up at the end of September on my decisions on how many hives am I going to go through winter, what equipment do I need, how much food is on the hives, and stuff like that. So really you're preparing all winter long, but it really focuses in at the end of summer, beginning of fall, because you prepare during the fall for your winters. So the two big questions is going to be, is there enough bees to survive winter? And do my bees have enough stores to get through winter? So you might have enough stores to get through winter, but you may have a really small cluster. And that's just as big of a problem as not having enough stores to get through winter. But it's okay, because if you plan ahead, we can manage that so it would be easy for us. So hive preparation. So you might have a weak hive and you know that the cluster's small and you're running out of time and you're not going to get them to build up in time. That's okay. What you'll have to do is combine your weak hives with a strong colony. What you don't want to do is combine two weak hives if you can prevent it. Because if you combine two weak colonies together, you're still probably going to have a mediocre or a weak colony still. If you combine a weak colony with a strong colony, that's going to give that strong colony an even better chance of survival in winter. So the way I do this is through the newspaper method. So what you'll do is you'll identify your weak colony and your strong colony. And you'll take your strong colony and you'll take off the top cover, the inner cover, and you're going to put down 2 sheets of newspaper. Poke a few holes in the newspaper to allow the pheromones to pass from the strong colony to the weak colony. And then you're going to combine your weak hive down to 1 box if possible. So you're probably not going to have your weak colony is not going to be a double deep. It's probably going to be down into a single. And that's what you're wanting to do, is condense the area that the pheromones have to go through. So you're going to place the weak hive on top of the newspaper. And then you're going to close it all up and you're going to check back in about a week. In that week's time, those honeybees are going to chew through that newspaper because they realize that it is not supposed to be in the hive. They're going to take it out, and all you're going to have left is the newspaper on the outside, which is really cool that they can work that fast. By the time that they chew through the top, by the time the top, the weak colony chews through the newspaper to the bottom colony and vice versa, they're going to have that pheromone introduced to them. So you're going to know they're going to, accept each other. What's important is that you decide which queen you're going to keep. And it's probably going to be the one in the strong colony, because what you don't want to do is introduce the weak colony's queen to the strong colony's queen and risk both queens dying. So you are going to want to find that queen in the weak colony and dispatch her so you do not have that battle within the hives. I always tell people that it is easier to lose a hive than to lose bees, because we saved the bees and we just combined them to another hive, and we didn't risk going through winter with our cluster being too small and the bees dying. After the summer solstice, I'm also thinking about, what are my weak queens? How old are my queens, and are they going to be good enough to lay into the fall and have a nice cluster of bees going into winter? So this is the time where I start to think if I'm going to requeen. So if you are going to requeen, it is important that your queen has enough time to go out on her mating flights, to come back, and to start laying before it gets too cold. What I usually tell people is, do not requeen, if possible, no later than the goldenrod or aster flow. So you kind of want to requeen during this flow, because that is going to be the peak of the fall. You're already going to have all the bees that you need to work that aster, the goldenrod. So this is a perfect time to requeen your hive so that queen can start laying for winter. Solstice queens are queens that are born after the summer solstice, and they are, kind of believed to be better queens that survive winter. And it's because they are a young, brand new queen, and it's going to lay longer into the season. So I typically replace my queens every 2 years, just to make sure that I have a good queen that is laying healthy eggs that are going to help the hive survive the winter. This is one of the queens that I raised this year. She's probably one of my favorite, just beautiful, and has that nice blue collar dot where I marked her. I don't always mark all of my queens, but sometimes I, like to play around just to, if I'm going to monitor that queen to see where she's going. And so in this instance, I did mark her. Honey supers. So you don't want to go in winter with all your honey supers on. So you want to have enough time to remove honey supers. I get a lot of questions of, when should I remove the honey super? Well, that all depends on what are your goals for your beekeeping season. Some people like the goldenrod honey. I, in particular, do not like the goldenrod honey, and it's just because it has a stronger taste, just not my style of honey. So I will typically remove my honey supers at the start of the goldenrod flow. This gives my hives the opportunity to pack the goldenrod honey into their deep, and so they can prepare their food stores for the winter. You don't want to leave your honey supers on too late, because then they're going to store all their stores in the honey super. And when you go to remove that, they're not going to have any stores down into the brood chamber that you want them to have to help survive the winter. So when you're removing the honey supers, you're assessing the food stores to see if there is enough food left in the colony or if it was all in the honey super. You're also going to use this as a time after you pull your honey supers off to treat. And by treating, I mean you're treating for varroa mites, which hopefully we have already done, in the end of the summer. I typically treat my hives in July. The earlier you treat them is the better chance of survival you're going to have, because the varroa mites are becoming a serious threat to the overwintering of colonies. So another thing is bottom boards and queen excluders. So you're going to want to remove the queen excluders at the end of the fall, because after you pull your honey supers, because you do not want to accidentally leave one on and run the risk of the cluster moving up the brood chamber in the winter to get access to food while the queen is stuck below the cluster and the queen dying. So as silly as it sounds, just double check your equipment, make sure you remove the queen excluder, because accidents do happen, and if you run multiple apiaries or hives, you're always going to forget something, and that's okay. Some people will use the screen bottom boards on their hive, so you want to make sure that either you replace that with a solid bottom board or secure the white plastic underneath of it so you're not having cold air rush up into the hive during the winter. So you just want to make sure that it's nice and airtight on the bottom so they're not getting that cold draft. So location of the beehive. You probably already have decided this when you started your apiary, but if you move your apiaries around, a good rule of thumb is to always have your apiary where the snow melts first or where the sun hits first. So this will help your hives warm up easier in the winter and keep the snow and everything away from them. You're also going to be thinking about a windbreak, because you don't want the cold winter air to chill your bees. So if you do not have a windbreak naturally, it's okay, because there's plenty of ways that you can still form a windbreak to help protect your bees. So windbreaks are important because, like I said, they're going to protect from the cold air. They're typically going to be on 3 sides of your hive. That's going to be on both sides and the back, leaving the front open. And if you're going to use straw or hay bales, it's important not to put them right up against your hive. You're going to want some dead air that is, able to get around the hive, so you're not building up excess moisture and are still getting the ventilation. So some people will also use pallets. Pallets, obviously will get some, drafts through them, but it does provide a little bit of a break. And, some will wrap that pallet with plastic or other material. And you can also have natural wind breaks if you have hedges or a hillside or, a tree line that is going to help protect and break up that wind before it gets to your guys' hives. Another question that people have during winter is, should I wrap my hives? Well, that is an excellent question, because a lot of people think that they need to bring their hives into a garage or a greenhouse, or they have to wrap them. I've even had people ask if they should put like heaters underneath of them. And all of this isn't necessary here in West Virginia. So wrapping a hive, the purpose is not to keep your hives warm. The purpose is to help your honeybees regulate the temperature within inside the hive. You don't want to give them the false perception that it is warm outside, because they are going to fly out of the hive and be shocked once they reach that cold air, and the cluster is not going to be, tight, and they could freeze to death. So there's different methods of wrapping. People use different materials. I'll go over those in the next slide. And when you're wrapping, it's very important that you ensure that they have ventilation on the top and the bottom. So you don't want your wrap to go right up against your top cover, and you don't want it to cover the bottom board too much because the bees still need to get ventilation in and out of the hive. So these are a couple different examples of wrapping. So on the left, you have somebody that has just used, tar roofing paper. They wrap the hive. It's black, it heats up a little faster. It's not going to have a lot of insulation for the hive, but it will help them regulate the temperature a little bit more. In the middle, somebody has used insulation. This wrapping job isn't the best. You kind of want to secure all the corners with duct tape or something so it doesn't, fall apart or get moisture in between the boards there. And then on the right-hand side is actually a product from Daydant called a Bee Cozy, and that is going to be some plastic that they sell to wrap your hives and insulate them a little bit better as well. So supplement feeding. So that was one of our big questions. Did we leave enough stores on the hive for them to survive winter? Here in West Virginia, you're going to want to leave approximately 40 to 50 pounds of, honey or some other type of supplement for them to survive the winter. So not all the time do we have a great fall flow. And if we do have a great fall flow and we harvest a little too much, or they still didn't produce enough, we can still add some different type of feeding into the hive to help ensure that they're going to have enough food storage to survive the winter. So some solutions to not enough stores is feeding a 2-to-1 sugar water. That is different from us feeding our 1-to-1 sugar water in the spring. The 2-to-1 sugar water is going to be a little thicker. It's going to help them build up the hive faster, and it kind of, is going to be more like the consistency of a honey instead of water. Another alternative to feeding sugar water would be to feed ProSweet. So ProSweet, I've had really good success from that. It's made by Man Lake there in that picture, and it has just, a little more nutrients and stuff in it. The bees seem to love it, and it really helps them build up fast. Pollen patties or dry pollen is also a way to help supplement the pollen in the hive. And I'll go over a couple ways that we can do that. This is Ultra Bee. So it is from Man Lake also, I believe. And it is awesome because you can buy it as the dry pollen, and you can use it as dry pollen, or you can mix it up and make pollen patties with it. Another thing people talk about a lot in the winter is adding sugar boards to their beehives. So sugar boards will help the hive, as like an emergency feed in winter, and it also will help them build up in the spring faster if you build them with a pollen patty inside of it or something. So pollen is very important to the hive because without pollen, they're not going to have that protein that they need to develop. So you can feed the pollen patty in the hive before winter, the pollen patty within the sugar board, or feed dry pollen. The problem with feeding pollen patties before winter is you're probably going to have a higher level of small hive beetles in the hives. And if you're putting a pollen patty in that is too big and the bees are not consuming it within a couple of days, then you're going to have issues with small hive beetle larvae. So pollen patties within the sugar board is going to be kind of used as, a sandwich effect. So you're going to have the sugar down, then you're going to put the pollen patty, and then you're going to put more sugar down. So by the time that they eat through part of the sugar, you're hoping that they're into that January, February, and they're going to start consuming that pollen, and they're going to start rearing brood faster and preparing for, March to right around the corner. You can also feed dry pollen, which is what I do the best. And it is because you can put them in these like little PVC pipe feeders, or I've seen even coffee jugs being used, nailed to a tree, just something to keep the pollen dry. and the bees will fly in and out of there on a warm day. If you feed birds during the winter, you'll see a lot of the time that the honeybees will roll around in the seeds that you're feeding, and they're grabbing the pollen from that as well. Or not pollen, but they're getting the protein and the dust from that. Will pollen patties get hive beetle eggs in the winter? I have not seen that. I do believe that the hive beetles do go into the ground during winter, so they're not something to worry about in the winter time. Should we feed pollen now or wait until late winter or early spring? So if your bees are showing a lack of pollen in the hive, I would definitely start feeding now, because even though we have, a flow going or wrapping up, we may have not had a strong pollen flow in all areas. That happened a few years ago. And the more pollen in the hive, the more protein, the better they're going to be going into winter. So, and late winter, early spring, any warm day really that is out, I will have my pollen set up. And if the bees are taking it, they need it. If they don't need it, they're not going to take it. Kind of a good rule of thumb there.
Yeah, Matt, if I may, if you scroll up your chat window,
yes,
there's a couple more questions up there.
Oh, okay. I didn't see those. My bad. Thank you.
Sure.
Can you leave the supers on if not taking honey? So yeah, you can leave the supers on. That's no problem. There'll be some times on the hives that I have left, a super or two on, and they've done just fine. It just gives them more, insurance per se through winter, and it's not going to hurt anything. And if they have extra through, you get through winter and they still have extra honey, you can take some of that honey off and still, run it through the extractor and use it and whatnot. You can also, if one hive doesn't have a lot of honey or stores and another one does, you can redistribute that between the two hives to kind of balance them out. A question regarding Formic Pro use. With the cooler weather, I decided to put Formic. Following instructions, I put 2 of the pouches in between the deeps. I did this about 4 p.m. I went out the next morning about 9 a.m. In one hive, there was a pile, maybe 300 bees out front. For all 5 hives, the bees stayed in the hive and none were coming out even a few hours later. I got scared and removed Formic Pro. Temps were in the 70s during the days. Should I only put 1 of the pouches on? Jennifer, at the end of the message, or at the end of this slideshow, I'll have my email and my phone number. If you'll shoot me a text message or an email, I will follow up with that. I've never really used Formic Pro, to be honest, so I'll have to look that up, but we'll definitely figure that one out there for you. So pollen patty recipe. This is what I was talking about. Buying the Ultra Bee is really nice because you can use it dry, but if you want to use a patty as well, you can. And on the bottom here, I just have a quick little recipe that will make only 5 to 8 patties, about 10 inches. It all depends on how thin that you roll them. When I'm making pollen patties, I'll put, of course, you're going to put it in between wax paper and then roll it out so it's, in between the wax paper. The bees will chew up the wax paper, no problem. And I will use, or I will roll it out to be about 1/4 of an inch thick is what I kind of like to use. So 1 quart, that's supposed to be of 1-to-1 sugar syrup, 6 to 8 cups of pollen substitute, and then 4 drops of lemongrass oil or 1 tablespoon of honeybee healthy. That just helps, entice them to consume that pollen patty. Are winter patties and pollen patties the same? So I think that they are used interchangeably. Sometimes the winter patties, people talk about a little different. I believe they might have a little more supplements, and I'll get right back to that question. So with the sugar syrup, you're going to want to not wait until it is too late. So late September into October is when you're going to really assess the hive to see if the hive has enough stores for winter. If not, you're going to want to start feeding. And that, like I said, that's late September into October, kind of after the Okay, John, thanks for, John sent me a message. So winter patties are mostly carbohydrates. So late September into October, that's when you're going to want to feed, especially this time of the year. If you're getting to the hives and you don't think they got 40 to 50 pounds of honey, you're going to want to put in some syrup. So you can do that either with the sugar water or you can be feeding the Pro Sweep. For every gallon of sugar water you feed, the 2-to-1, is thought to be you gain about 7 pounds of food stores in your hive. So distribution of food stores, like I was saying, move honey around if it's necessary. If you have a lot of honey frames in the middle, but you don't have honey frames on the outside, this is the time of the year you're going to move those honey frames to the outside and kind of have that empty brood area comb in the middle. And food stores should be above the cluster and not below. So we got to make sure that the bees are sitting below where the honey is and that the top box should not be honey bound, meaning the top box should have some area on the bottom, kind of the bridge, where they have that empty comb, and the bees will move up in the hive to access stores, but they don't go down in the winter time. So the reason that you don't want the top box to be honey bound is when they are working their way up to that box in the winter, they need a place to be able to cluster, and they can only cluster if there is not honey in the cells. So if there's honey or sugar water in the cells, they're not going to be able to cluster on that frame, and they're not going to be able to regulate the temperature. So sugar boards. So this is something that's nice to add to your hive, just, as an extra precaution. You're like, oh, I'm not so positive that I have enough. We're going to add this on just in case they need it. I'll add this on pretty much all of my hives in the winter, just in case. Some of them will touch it and some of them won't. That's okay. So it's useful if you cannot get the hives built up in time. The sugar boards are typically a 2-inch high board. They have a 1/2 inch wire mesh on the inside, so that's going to be on the bottom. They kind of staple it around the inside of the box, and then they will lay down wax paper, just like we were talking about with the pollen patties. So the recipe for a candy board or sugar board, this one is a non-cooked recipe, so some people actually will put like a hard candy in there. This one is not. 16 pounds of sugar, 3 cups of water, give or take. If it's super crumbly, you can add a little bit more water. You just don't want it to be, too wet. And then 1 pollen patty. Like I was saying, the pollen patty is in between, in the middle of the board, and it's kind of in the middle of the sugar as well. Some people will use fondant, and that's okay as well. The important thing about sugar board is you still want to have the ventilation. So some of them will have that hole there in the front. That's perfect. And they also put that piece of 2x4 in there as they're building the sugar, because once that's removed, it's going to give the bees a starting point on where to come up and start chewing and eating, consuming the sugar. And it also allows for that ventilation there on the top of the board. So another thing is to control moisture in the hive. This is extremely important. A healthy hive can survive the cold days and nights of winter, with the exception that there is not an abundance of moisture in the hive. So moisture in the hive is pretty much a death sentence to bees. As honeybees are consuming their honey stores and metabolizing it, they give off moisture. And the moisture then rises through the warm hive, through the cluster, and rises to the top where it comes in contact with the cold, top cover, inner board, whatever it might be in the hive. Once it comes in contact with that cold, board, it's going to turn into condensation. And as the condensation is growing and there's more and more condensation in the hive, it's going to eventually form into water droplets and drip back down into the cluster, chilling the brood. So we don't want, you're warm, you're in winter, and you're in your house, and now all of a sudden you've got cold water dripping down on you. You wouldn't like that either. So it's not good for the bees. And there's ways that we can prevent that. So from the top picture, that is a quilt box from Daydant. And it does have another piece that kind of covers where you guys can see the gap in between the two boxes. There is a piece that would go in there. So they're also really easy to build. I'll build them out of some of my supers that I have extra from the season, and then I can just, disassemble them and, use them again. And what it is, you put a mesh on the bottom of the box, and you're going to fill that box with, either like cedar shavings. So as that moisture is coming up through the hive, it will still make contact, but it drips back down. And when it drips back down, it's going to drip onto the wood shavings, so it's not going to get onto the bees. It is important that there's still ventilation through this, so they have ventilation on the side there, 2 holes on each side. But I've also seen, I have not had any experience with this. I met a beekeeper in the Northern Panhandle that had one of these this year, and it is a moisture board from Man Lake, and it just looks like, compact, sawdust, and it is supposed to have the same effect where that board will absorb the moisture from the hive. And, obviously it takes up a lot less room than having a whole quilt box on top. So we have the ventilation in the hive, so the water droplets can kind of, evaporate through the top, but it's also important to give a slight tilt forward of the hive. That, will help, any of the snow that's melting, so the snow's not rolling back into the hive, or the water droplets aren't rolling back into the hive, so everything will roll out the front of the hive. So it's really important to make sure it doesn't have to be a major tilt, but you just don't want all of the moisture, water rolling back into the hive during the winter. So winter pests, this is kind of a different thing that we don't have to worry about during, the regular season, but coming fall and winter, we're going to have to think a little bit more of, and that is going to be mice. So mice love, a nice, warm, cozy place. They try to get into our house during the winter, our campers, our buildings. Well, they love to get into beehives, and they're not always the best roommates, as you can see. And they're also not easy to evict, so don't let them move in. So you're not going to know that you have mice usually until you open up your hive in the spring. And by that time, the mice have already damaged 3 or 4 frames, chewing them up, chewing the wax. They'll not always, they're not as tidy as honeybees. They will use the bathroom inside. They don't go outside all the time. And it's a perfect home for the mouse during the winter, because they have everything they need right there. They have all the honey to eat, and they're good. So the good thing is mice typically do not eat honeybees, and they're just mainly there for the warmth that the honeybees are giving off and for the honey and other food stores. So preventing mice from moving in. So you can either buy a mouse guard from a beekeeping supply store, or you can build one your own. Building one your own is the way I go, because it's, cost effective and it's simple to do. All you need is a 1/2 inch hardware cloth or smaller. You fold it into an L shape after you cut it the width of the front of the hive, and you secure it with staples so that way the mice can't pull it out and still climb in. Or you can alternatively, fold it into a V shape and shove it into the entrance and kind of wedge it in there. I typically don't like that, just because you still run the risk of it falling out. So I always do the L shape and secure it with staples. And I've never had mice issues after I've installed either a mouse guard or the hardware cloth. The cool thing about the honeybees is that sometimes they'll try to evict the mice themselves. So sometimes the mice might die in the hive, but the mice are way too big for the honeybees to carry out on their own. So if they're too big to remove, they have 2 options. They can remove most of it, or they can propolize it. So there's an example on the top where they have chewed up and tried to remove as much of the mouse as they can. Obviously, bees are not meat eaters. They don't, consume the mouse, or they'll propolize it. So they realize that it runs a risk of bringing, bacteria into the hive as it's decaying. So they will cover it up with propolis and kind of get rid of it that way. And then another big one is varroa mites. So going into winter with a high mite count can mean death for the colony. A lot of the times when people lose their honeybees, it's either due to, in the winter, it's either due to the varroa mite, moisture, or they're starving to death. So you always want to check mite levels through an alcohol wash or a sugar shake in September. A lot of times people don't feel comfortable with killing their bees as you're getting into late fall. So a sugar shake works just as well in this instance. And we're, of course, monitoring our mite counts throughout the year and treating when necessary. Successful overwintering has resulted from aggressive monitoring of varroa mite throughout the year. And you don't want to wait until it's too late. Everyone has mites. So I don't care, what people say, oh, I'm not seeing mites. You're probably still going to have mites, unfortunately. It's just something that we've got to live with now. There are coming more and more issues with the varroa mites. And if you're seeing varroa mites in your hive, it's probably getting too late if you're seeing too many of them, because most of the varroa mites are going to be underneath of the cappings where you're not going to see. So we've already treated throughout the year for varroa mites, and it's always good to hit them again in the winter. And a great way to do this is with the oxalic acid treatment. So this is an approved method for treating varroa mite infestations, and it's best used when there is little to no brood. So that makes it perfect for the winter. I typically suggest that people treat for varroa mites with the oxalic acid treatment, around the Christmas time. So you're not going to have a lot of brood, if any, during this time, and you're going to knock down your mite counts extremely low. So you want to go into spring with as low mite counts as possible, because it's going to allow your colony to build up faster and prepare for the honey flow. And this is one of the methods. This is a vaporizer. There's also people that use foggers and other methods with the oxalic acid treatment. So either one of them, I've heard both good and bad things about both of them. So find out what you like the best and get that treatment on there. It'll have great success. Monitoring your beehives in the winter. So a lot of people, get that nervous feeling. They don't know what their bees are doing. They don't know if their hive is dead or if they're alive. And some people think that their hive is dead only for them to, once they warm up a little bit, to come to life again. So there's a couple ways that I suggest that people do that, and that's either with the stethoscope or with a FLIR or another type of thermal camera imaging. So the good or the important thing is you don't want to go up to the hive and you don't want to knock on it. When you're knocking on the hive in the winter, it's going to cause the bees to break the cluster and kind of get disturbed. They're wanting to see what's happening, who's knocking on my hive. So these are two great ways where you can monitor where your cluster is at and not have to disturb the bees. So with the thermal camera, it's important to note that if you're not going to get an accurate temperature of what the temperature is inside your hive, but it is going to show you where your cluster is at. And you can track to see, probably how much stores they have based on how far they're moving up. Jennifer had another great one, is a brood minder. Yep, that is another tool that you can use as well. A lot of new beekeepers will also get afraid when they are seeing a lot of bees that are dead outside. So you can see this a lot if there's snow on the ground. You'll see the bees that are, dead, that they're outside the hive and they think that their hive is dying. This is, something that you just got to look at and monitor, because the bees will not fly for a few days or a week at a time. And then once they get that break in the weather, they'll start doing cleansing flights. So they'll take out any bees that may have passed away during the last few days. They'll also relieve themselves because they don't use the bathroom inside. It's nothing to be worried about. It's just the bees being hygienic and taking care of their hive, so there is not a bunch of decaying bees inside the hive. So after we're getting into winter, we've done all of our preparation. It's time to prepare for the next season. And a lot of people think that the beekeeper's year starts in the fall, because based on what we're doing in the fall, that is how we're planning for our spring. So we kind of start in the fall as our beekeeping season. So this is the time to organize your equipment, to order new equipment, to build frames. I know when I went from 10 hives up to 30 that one year, I spent all winter, it seemed like, building frames. So this is a perfect time to, build those frames and paint those boxes and getting ready for swarming season. This is also a good time to order additional nukes and packages. I always tell people to order their nukes or packages as early as they can, because the later you wait, the risk of getting them later in the season, goes up. So you kind of want to get your nukes and your packages, right around the time the dandelions are blooming. If you need / want to paint, when is the best time to paint? So anytime is really a good time to paint. I usually, if I don't paint my hives that are out in the yard. So if there is a hive that needs repaired, I would have replaced them into a new hive for the winter, and then I would have took that hive in and then painted it. I usually set up in my basement or in my bee building, and I will just paint all of the hives that need painted for the season without, the bees in them. So, and then I'll swap out the equipment that needs to be repaired, right before winter, during the fall, and then have that equipment that needs to be repaired, and I'll do that in the winter. So we have prepared for the season and we're ready to go. And, our bees should be good for the winter. We made sure that they have enough bees to get through winter, that they have enough stores, and that we are controlling the pests and the moisture. So that is what I have. I have, plenty of time for questions. Anybody that has questions, continue adding them to the chat. That is my personal cell number, so you can shoot me a text message or email me at Birds and Bees Honey, and I would be more than glad to talk about bees. So Faith has a question. I have an interesting situation. I was wondering what to do. She has 3 hives. The first is very strong with 2 deeps already and plenty of honey stores. My other 2 hives were split, and I made pretty late into the summer, so they're not as strong. In fact, both small hives have not filled their 1 deep yet. However, both have new queens born and mated in August. You mentioned the newspaper method of combining hives with my strong hive, like previously mentioned, already 2 deeps brood, but you also mentioned that combining 2 weeks hives is not a good option. What would you recommend? So if you think that you can overwinter them as a single deep, that is also okay. You do not have to always winter as a double deep. I've had experience where I've wintered with a single deep, a double deep, triple deep, and I've had success with all of them. So it's just important that if they are a single deep, that they have plenty of bees to get through the winter, and that they have the honey stores. And if they don't have the honey stores, like I said, you can supplement the feeding to kind of bulk them up a little bit so they can survive the winter. That was a good question. Is there any other questions? What do you recommend is a good hive setup for winter? Double deeps or single deep and a single medium? So I always feel most comfortable with going in with double deeps, but I have overwintered with the single deep and a single medium. I have not given that a try yet. So I would definitely lean more towards the, at least a single deep. But again, it all has to do with how many bees and, how much, food stores do they have in there. So the single medium, that would worry me a little bit. I probably would feel more comfortable with a double medium, but definitely, have had tremendous success with both double deeps and single deeps. These are great questions, guys.
We had a new question come
What
in.
can I do to increase brood production now? Queen is still laying beautifully. So brood production, unfortunately, right now is going to be on to the decrease. So the queen will start decreasing her brood production as the weather gets cooler. So as the days get shorter. So she is still laying beautifully right now. That's perfect. Just still make sure that they have the plenty of stores, both being pollen and honey, and she will continue to lay until the days get shorter. Going back up to your question, Don, about leaving the honey supers on if you're not
Sure.
taking the honey, it's important to note too that if you are going to use the oxalic acid treatment, that you are, it is not approved to be used with honey supers on. So just make sure that if you are leaving them on, that honey is to be consumed by the bees later on and not somebody else.
Yeah, and by the way, I wanted to mention to the group that Weller Bee Supplies has a butane oxalic acid vaporizer, and that makes it portable. And it's somewhere between $100 and $200. He's selling them so fast that I think he keeps raising the price, so I can't say for sure what the price is right now. But that's a very convenient way to apply the oxalic acid. So we're going to get a chance to test that out this year. Then we'll be reporting back to the bee clubs.
All right. Any other questions? Thank you, Russ. I appreciate it. Is it too late to add formic acid for mites? Um, let me look that up real quick. I would, this time of the year, I typically switch over to using oxalic acid because the brood is kind of decreasing, because it's easier to use that than to use one of the other mite treatments. And Jennifer also said that Weller Bee Supply has a video of the vaporizer being used. So I didn't mention the use of fondant. Is that about the same as a sugar board? So yeah, that is, you can put that fondant on just like you would the sugar board. So some people use their sugar boards and some people use the fondant. And some people use the fondant in the sugar board. So absolutely, fondant is another way. I know that the Mon County Beekeeping Association gets a deal on the fondant for their club members, and they seem to have great success by using fondant. And when do you put in sugar patties? So I typically start putting in sugar patties, and it kind of depends on what are the stores looking like. So right now I'm still would be feeding a liquid, and I would probably put the sugar patties on once it's getting too cold at night to feed liquid. So once that sugar syrup and everything starts freezing, switching over to those sugar patties, probably around the end of October. Planning to use Apivar this fall with oxalic in December. Yeah, that works also. So, the oxalic acid is, like I said, just the really the only thing that you could use in the winter, because you can't open up the hives and, use the other treatments. So oxalic acid is perfect in, December, because that is going to knock down any other mites that might have survived your Apivar treatment or that have came into the hive after you got done treating. And it's also important, like Don's saying, he has, 3 different treatments. You don't want to use the same treatment over and over, because the mites, can build up that resistance to some. So there's a couple methods that used to be used frequently in the US that the mites have built up that resistance to. So just kind of like humans, if we're taking the same medicine over and over, our bodies can build up the resistance to that, just as mites can build up the resistance to their treatments. The 16 pounds of sugar to 3 cups of water for the sugar boards, is that recipe for one hive? Yes, so that is what they are putting in the one of the sugar boards. So going back to the Formic Pro question, I do have the better answer for that now. So Tim, is it too late to add Formic Pro acid for mites? So it is getting a little bit too late, because the use of Formic Pro needs to be done when outside day temperatures are above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, because the bees play an active role, because they have to move that formic acid vapor from where you've installed it throughout the hive. So they don't need to, the more active they are, the better that treatment is. So if you put it in now, they're, and it's getting cold throughout the day, they're not going to be moving that acid around because they're going to be kind of in that cluster. I've heard of adding essential oils to sugar boards to help prevent tracheal mites and such. Do you recommend? So that I've heard that as well. I don't add them into mine. It's not saying that you can't. It's just one of those things that where some people will and others will not. And everything that I said in the presentation isn't necessarily right or wrong. I always like to tell people to find what works best for them. Especially when you're talking about wrapping hives. You'll have people that, you know, are all for wrapping hives and some people that are not. Some people that like reducing the entrance, some people that do not like reducing their entrances of their hive. So if it works for you, that's okay. So what works for you may not work for me and vice versa. So that's why I kind of covered a broad topic of things in the presentation. And I always go by the rule of thumb. I tell new beekeepers, if you ask two beekeepers the same question, you'll get 5 different answers.